people. It's nice to have y'all here. Thank you for joining us for this marijuana discussion in the Trump era. Things have changed. I'm Jasmine Tyler from Human Rights Watch, and I'm going to let the panel go ahead and start by introducing themselves, their organizations, and their sort of, we give a little bit of the landscape just to set the groundwork for the question, for the discussion we're going to have. I'm going to go through a moderated discussion with the panelists for a little while, and we're going to open it up to questions for the audience to have an interactive dialogue. If you're sitting in the back, feel free to come up. There's lots of spaces up here. We're a movement and a family, so we want to be inclusive. And when I do come out to the audience, remember, you don't get to hold the mic. I'll hold the mic. And you should praise whatever it is you want to say in the form of a question that's very short. Okay, so first we're going to kick it off with Tamar.
All right, thank you, Jasmine. So my name's Tamar Todd. I'm the legal director at the Drug Policy Alliance, where I've been for about 12 years, probably the last 10, working heavily focused on marijuana policy. I do a lot of the legislative drafting of state laws and also of ballot initiatives, and I've been involved in some capacity in drafting most of them with partners in the room and with MPP from 2012 through the 2016 cycle. It feels, to me, it feels a little familiar, like being in this wait and see holding pattern that we've been in the part of this year. I remember sort of a similar feeling after Colorado and Washington passed in 2012, and we waited for 10 months to see how the Obama administration was going to react, and we hit about our different predictions and lobbied in different ways. But, you know, so to some sense it's a guess, and I think we hang on to everything we hear Sessions say and Trump say and try to predict. But I guess my basic sort of prediction and hope about it and about where Sessions is that, you know, I think fundamentally Sessions likes marijuana prohibition, and he likes marijuana prohibition because it's a useful tool for racial subjugation, and that's his primary motivating force. And I think when you look at that, that gives you, you know, who's going to join him in that. I think for people who are maybe less racist, they're going to look at the actual policies we've seen in the states and what's happened in Washington and Colorado, and whether we're moving in a better public policy direction than we were before, and the answer to that is yes. And they're not going to want to disrupt that. And then if you're more of his camp, you're going to look and say, well, is interfering with, you know, and dismantling a sophisticated multi-million-dollar industry that's bubbled up and is now funding state revenue streams, and is largely not actually the people of color in it, you know, is coming in and interfering, not gonna do things. And I think the answer to those things are no. And I don't think we're going to have a lot of people supporting what he may personally want to do, and we can talk more as we move on in terms of what happens in place of a direct attack from Sessions and how to do that.
Hey everybody, my name is Michael Collins. I am the Deputy Director at the Office of National Affairs for Drug Policy Alliance. I handle marijuana policy at the federal level. I've been there for 4 years and have been involved in all the major marijuana developments at the federal level, the Rohrabacher Amendment, the McClintock Amendment, CARES Act, Booker Bill, Sanders, whatever else has been involved. Anyway, so I see sort of, since we last met, you know, 2 years ago in DC, I think there are sort of 3 changes or emerging trends at the federal level, and one is, you know, what Tamar discussed, the challenge of Sessions in the Trump administration, which I think we'll get into, and I largely agree with Tamar in the sense that, you know, we're not in a good space, and to a certain extent it's a little bit damaging orientations across the board on drug policy. But I guess the question is, like, will we go backwards, or will Sessions set us backwards? I think you'll have a chilling effect, and we won't make the progress that maybe we had thought under a different administration, but it's also hard to put the genie back in the bottle in legalization. The other trend at the federal level is the arrival, I mean, they had already really arrived, but the real arrival of the industry at the federal level, which is not always on the same page as this kind of old school, I guess, marijuana reform movement and the sort of influence and focus of the industry. And then the last trend in development I see is the sort of, in my eyes, welcome arrival of a more robust discussion about how do we legalise marijuana, and specifically not just really discussing like should we legalise marijuana, but a lot of legislators now thinking about issues around racial justice and diversity and inclusion a lot more, and you know, the Cory Booker bill this year was a good example of that. And so those are three of the developments that I would say are currently in place at the federal level.
Right on. So I'm Rob Campion with the Marijuana Policy Project based in Washington, D.C. Started MPP 22 years ago, and when I was 7 or something, and you know, MPP's been responsible for changing about half of the state marijuana laws, about half medical marijuana, about half the legalization, including Colorado. So in thinking about this panel, which is a lot of federal stuff, I just came up with a paradigm of how to kind of put it into little buckets. So if you think about federal action as Congress temporary action, Congress permanent change of law, then executive temporary and executive permanent. So imagine 4 buckets. 2 of the 4 are interesting right now, short term. So with regard to the executive branch, people oftentimes talk about rescheduling marijuana. That's of almost no interest legally, or perhaps philosophically, certainly medically, but not legally. So generally you won't hear me talking about rescheduling. It's a distraction, and federal penalties are not linked to the scheduled status of marijuana. So scheduling is 1, and I'll skip that probably hopefully for the next hour and a half. 2 is the Cole memo, which is an administrative memo from the Justice Department, which is very temporary, and I know we're going to talk about that. 3 is legislation. Temporary legislation is called appropriations amendments, and I know that Michael and I are scheduled to have a debate on this panel on a little bit of that. Now we agree actually on what should happen. It's just a question of how scared we should be, and as it turns out, I'm actually more scared than this guy, so that's the paradigm. So appropriations is temporary legislation, lasts for 1 year. And then permanent changes in law in Congress is something that ain't going to happen with marijuana in this Congress, except maybe tax reform, which is extremely unlikely, okay? So permanent changes in law, we talk about legalization paradigms. That's good to talk about. Just remember, it won't be 2017, 2018, of course, right? So that'll be like a futuristic kind of conversation, which is worth having. So that's sort of how I look at it, and therefore my comments will probably gravitate towards those 2 kind of temporary slots out of the 4.
My name is John Hudak. I'm a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. We're a nonpartisan think tank and don't have an advocacy agenda. I personally, in my work, don't have an advocacy agenda with regard to marijuana. What I advocate for is good government that's responsive to its voters and its constituents, and a government that is functional enough to bring the ideas intended within public policy to actual public policy outcomes. I've been working on drug policy for about 5 years now. My traditional training is actually studying the executive branch of the federal government, studying the presidency, studying bureaucratic organization, regulation, personnel, things like that. So this panel actually brings the 2 loves of my research life together in a nice way. Typically, I think in this space, the study of marijuana policy and the study of the executive branch seemingly don't have many people doing both of those things. When I tell people in my sort of former political scientist life that these are the things I do, they tend not to understand it. When I tell my friends, they seem not to understand how those 2 are connected. I will say I think one connection is that since the new president was sworn in, I have friends who are consuming a lot more marijuana. That's one combination that I see in the overlap of my work. Yeah, it is harm reduction. And so I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to engage these issues. My perspective sometimes, a lot of times, is pretty boring, getting into the nitty-gritty of how bureaucracies work and how individual personnel within the federal government have transparent or sometimes non-transparent oversight or roles in the regulation of drugs. And so I'm happy to be on the panel and engage your questions after.
Hello, my name is Wanda James, and my husband and I are the first legally licensed African Americans to own a dispensary and edible company and a grow facility in America. I love saying that. So I'm on this panel because I am the Malcolm X to all of their MLKs. Extremely smart people sitting up here. My background is in politics and cannabis. I have been a connoisseur of cannabis since I was in college at the University of Colorado. And for those of you who know anything about Colorado, the University of Colorado invented joints. We did, absolutely, it's proven. But the bigger part of what I do is politics. So for the last 30 years of my life, I ran for Congress and lost in California, and that got me started. But since then, I have run 3 congressional campaigns, God knows how many city and state campaigns, I don't know how many activism campaigns, and was also on Barack Obama's National Finance Committee, and I ran Congressman Jared Polis's first campaign in Colorado, who is one of the most outspoken advocates on this subject. So I don't say all of that to say all the amazing things that I've done, because what I am is a pothead, and I say that very proudly. But what I do know is, and I think that everybody up here and DPA, and they do an amazing job of all of the common sense, let's talk about how we're going to do this, let's talk about the bureaucracy, let's talk about how we're going to convince Jeff Sessions to do what we want to. I come from a little bit different point. Like I said, I'm the Malcolm X to their MLKs. No change in America has ever happened because somebody wrote a white paper. None, zero, zip. All of that stuff comes after that we the people have made the change. Amendment 64 that started this whole legalization process, and MPPs, Mason Tavert was a part of that, Vicente Cedarberg. Man, we got dogged out in Colorado. That ain't gonna happen. This is dumb. You guys are wasting money. What the hell are you doing? This is so stupid, 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 stupid. Yeah, it won by a landslide. And it started the match that is making all of these other states win by a landslide. It's not because California wrote a great white paper on election year. It happened because we the people decided to make changes. In Trump's America, we are forgetting that we the people are still in charge. Now, some of the people aren't on the right path, and so we need to help them move that. But without your words, without your pressure, because every politician, every single politician from dog catcher on up has one goal, one, to get reelected. The minute that they think that they're unpopular and they're not going to get reelected, they will change every opinion that they have and drop it like a hot potato, and tomorrow morning they'll all be cannabis activists if 100% of Americans decided that they loved it. Well, 100% of Americans haven't decided yet, but I believe 56% of us have, 50-80% of us have. Which means that a lot of these politicians are going to want to start getting elected again, but they need to hear from you. And that's where this starts. So if you guys aren't in the trenches, if we're not fighting this, they can write as many white papers and policy papers, and they can go talk to Jeff Sessions, and none of that is going to matter until we say, you know what, we're done. Done.
Amen.
So I'm going to kick off this discussion, and I want to get a little bit more landscape from you guys, if I can. We've heard a lot about Sessions, and I just want to hear a little bit more about what the rest of the administration looks like. Can you talk a little bit about where DEA is, where ONDCP stands, where the nominees stand, who's in what role yet, what's to come, just so we get a better picture of what the administration looks like, and then we can start, going from there, because I want everybody in the audience to get a sense beyond Sessions what we're working with.
Sure, I'll jump in first. We're oddly in a place of flux right now with some of the appointees. So we have a vacancy at the head of DEA, we have a vacancy at the head of HHS, although the previous HHS chief and frankly the previous DEA chief were no friends of the advocacy movement in this space. I can't imagine that the president chooses marijuana reformers to fill those roles. that's going out on a very short limb with that guess. In terms of ONDCP, the president's pick for that post is an opponent of marijuana reform, even though the number of opioid deaths in the district that he represented in Pennsylvania when he was in the House of Representatives is appalling. But he is someone who knows a lot of things, including that marijuana is this disastrously addictive drug that causes all kinds of social ills. The reality is that there are a lot of people in the administration who play a lot of roles. Most of them, even if they have a position on marijuana, don't end up engaging with marijuana too often because there are a lot of other fish to fry. That's true of the president. It tends to be true of the HHS secretary, the attorney general, actually. That's the case too. But the reality is making yourselves heard to those people is still critically important. We're in a very different place right now in terms of who are heading federal agencies, federal cabinet departments, and other offices than we were 10 months ago, 13 months ago. And it is something that puts an advocacy movement not necessarily at total risk, but certainly in a position to be more cognizant of the realities, more flexible to what is going on, and frankly, changing messaging. The way you have to communicate with Loretta Lynch is different than the way you have to communicate with Jeff Sessions. But there's ways to communicate. I think this period of flux makes it harder because we don't know who's going to take these critical roles in our government. And as the presidential nominees come up, it's going to be important to think about the background of those people, think about the arguments they have made, even if those are really shitty arguments, and think about the way that your understanding, your knowledge, your experience, your advocacy, your activism can be packaged in a way that they at least understand and maybe respect, or at least are scared to death that you might actually cause trouble for, I should say.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I mean, going back to Jasmine's question, I think there are, three areas or three roles almost which are interesting in the marijuana debate. And ONDCP, for me, the drugs opposition, it's doesn't have much power in the area of marijuana. It's a symbolic position. Like even drug policy writ large, they don't have a ton of power to do damage. I mean, certainly it's not good to have someone who's anti-marijuana in that position, but they don't do the prosecutions and some of the other more dangerous stuff that we are worried about. The new DEA role will be very interesting. I think it will offer the opportunity to ask tough questions during confirmation hearings, but I fear that one of the things that we saw in recent months was a sort of split with a really interesting split with the DEA and Jeff Sessions on the issue of marijuana research, where the DEA had been instructed last year to review and allow more applications for research for marijuana purposes, for research facilities to take place, and what came through in one of the articles was, what I saw was the DEA had leaked the story that Jeff Sessions and other rank and file were blocking those research applications going forward, which is just an indication of where, he's, when you have an Attorney General who's sort of further to the right on marijuana than the DEA, and the DEA is your friend on this issue, you realise how messed up things are. And I think in that sense, Jeff Sessions, the extent to which he has a say in who is the new head of the DEA, which you would think logically he would have a lot of say, he will bring in, something similar to the people he's brought in at the Department of Justice already, people like Steve Cook, who are very gung-ho on the drug war and very much against marijuana. I mean, one of the things that I thought was one of the more dangerous developments thus far under Jeff Sessions, which somewhat went under the radar, was when the Department of Justice submitted their budget request to Congress, and they asked for, I think it was 20 prosecutors to be housed under the DEA, right? Now, prosecutions at the federal level are usually done by US attorneys, right? And they don't just prosecute drugs, they prosecute any federal issue. This was Jeff Sessions wanting the DEA to do federal prosecutions specifically on drugs. Just think about how much damage that could do, and think about if you had someone who was really gung-ho on the issue of marijuana and you had the DEA actually doing prosecutions. how bad the situation would be in. And that's sort of similar to the last part, which is the issue of US attorneys and the nominations, which has been a very slow process and quite a fraught process with, normally senators from the state of which the US attorneys can be nominated have a say and have some sway in terms of the nominations, and that's a good thing, but that process hasn't really been happening. There has been, the Democrats really have been left out of any conversation around US attorneys, and Jeff Sessions has been very involved in the process, and Trump himself has been meeting with US attorneys and interviewing them. Again, let me just repeat, Trump has been meeting with prosecutors. That doesn't happen normally, that's not a normal situation. So those are sort of three areas in which we should pay attention, but for me the area around the DEA is very concerning, and whoever we get as the next DEA administrator will be a real sign of where we're going to go on this issue.
Yeah, I was actually going to raise the same point about the importance of the appointments for U.S. attorneys in the legalization states, because even if the current administration decides to continue the previous administration's policy, the Cole memo, that's basically one of prosecutorial discretion of giving those U.S. attorneys the power to decide when those federal priorities are being protected and when they're not. And we saw even under the previous administration, when there was an individual U.S. attorney who had a specific issue with marijuana, like in the northern parts of California, she went after certain actors, even under that previous policy without being reined in or controlled by the Department of Justice.
Just quickly on that point, it's important to remember the Cole memo is advisory for U.S. attorneys. It is.
We're going to get into that, I promise. I got a lot of questions and I'm trying to slow walk it.
Yeah, so I'll be very quick. This is advisory. It's telling U.S. attorneys don't prosecute cases under these circumstances. That is not binding. The only way that it is binding is if you defy it and you have an attorney general who slaps you around because of this happening, or a president who fires you because you've defied this order. I don't see Trump or Sessions doing that to U.S. attorneys who decide to violate the Cole memo and start prosecuting people in these states. So it's important to note just how tenuous that is.
So we have one more landscape question, if you guys could just indulge me, I promise. Like I said, sister, we're going to get to the Cole memo. But we've talked about Sessions, who is the entire worst. He was too racist to become a federal judge. He thought the Klan was okay until he found out they smoked marijuana. The list goes on, his entire name, whatever. We know that Tom Marino, the congressman from Pennsylvania, who you heard about is the nominee for drug czar, is opposed to marijuana. He's opposed to sentencing reform as well. He, I think, also was a little bit opposed to the CARA bill, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. He's in support of indefinite involuntary commitment. I mean, he's also the worst. We know that this guy Fuentes from New Jersey, who's been potentially nominated for or floated for the DEA position, he hearts racial profiling. So these are all problematic cast of characters, right? But let's talk about this head honcho for a second. Where's Trump on marijuana? The business guy. And maybe, right, this minute, maybe not next minute, but let's just get a little bit about where this crazo is.
So, yeah, it was kind of weird when he accidentally got elected that I had to sort of like put it in perspective to the audiences that were crying, and I had to sort of like come up with a perspective that would have them, sort of scooping themselves up off the floor, but not standing for Trump. So I'm anti-Trump, and I always was, except that I did note that he had a slightly better position than Clinton on marijuana. And when people say, well, you can't believe what he says, contradicts himself. Yes, except weirdly, he didn't even contradict himself on marijuana, like ever. And so you could say that you don't care because that in and of itself could be an accident, right? And that's fine, because I don't want to psychoanalyze him, God forbid. But what I would say is that he didn't actually contradict himself. So the position was states' rights for marijuana, and by the way, medical marijuana is actually good for you. So they put a little cherry on top, right? So I thought it was interesting because people, almost everyone I know, I think 99-point-something% of everyone I know is vociferously anti-Trump, whether libertarian or liberal, and I know a couple of Republicans too. And so I had to say, like, you have to sort of keep in mind that when Sean Spicer says what he said at the microphone in the spring, which was interestingly, like, I think while we were doing a conference call with Dana Rohrabacher, it was like happening as, like, in real time, and Spicer said, I believe that the Justice Department will blah, blah, blah. And so people were freaking out, and I was like, I think I heard that right, so I read it. It was 230 words that Spicer said, and the punchline was, I believe blah, blah, blah about the Justice Department, which isn't even his job, right? So I think it's important to sort of remember that when someone says that, it doesn't actually mean new policy or new position or reversal of anything, okay? So when you boil it all down, Trump is philosophically, and I do believe he's actually philosophically aligned with, like, just doesn't care about marijuana because he's in New York City, his friends smoke pot, everyone's, you know, doing drugs, having sex, etc. in New York and Manhattan. He doesn't care. But he chose Sessions, and that's a bad thing. So I think when we talk about the levers of power, and we think about who has the power, it's not the drug czar, you're correct. It's the sort of the DEA, but only barely. It's the AG, it's the Attorney General that matters. And the Attorney General matters so much more than the President. The President has almost no authority on anything that we care about with regard to marijuana after he appoints the AG.
So I guess the one thing on the Spicer comments that struck me that did give me cause for concern was, you know, it was a question, I think, from like a Skype question from some Arkansas reporter, I believe, at the time. And the one thing that was a red flag for me that made me think that this was a decision, this wasn't sort of, he wasn't speaking off the cuff, was he mentioned the Rohrabacher Amendment. He was like, there's a rider. And like, that said to me, that's, you know, the Rohrabacher Amendment is household name, like people know it in this room, but I don't think, you know, like, you know, my parents know about it, you know, it's not that kind of issue. And so it said to me that, like, there was the possibility that he had been briefed on this and briefed on what to say. You're right, his position did echo the president's position on this, like medical marijuana is okay, recreational marijuana not okay. But I was just a little bit struck by the fact that he had the knowledge to talk about the Rohrabacher Amendment. And the other thing I'll say about the Trump administration, and I mentioned this in a panel yesterday, Trump was a very bizarre candidate, right, in so many ways. And he was bizarre within the Republican Party because he doesn't necessarily owe his power to traditional conservative Republican constituents, right? A lot of the kind of Republican Party establishment like opposed him and didn't want him to. There were certain constituencies, there were a number of constituencies that did support him from day one and that he does owe something to, and one of those constituencies is evangelicals, and one of them is law enforcement. And law enforcement especially has a real seat at the table in the Trump administration. He's tweeting out like high-fiving, you know, cops every day and going speeches before cops and blah blah blah, and like law enforcement in this arena has typically not been our friend, and it worries me when, you know, law enforcement, you know, NALSA, those kind of like organizations, FOP, have such a close relationship with Trump, because I think Trump is he's not Jeff Sessions on this, but what you really need is someone to push back against Jeff Sessions, right? And you need someone to say like, I'm not down with that. And when he has a lot of people in his ear, as well as Jeff Sessions saying like, this marijuana legalization is a bad idea, we've got to stop it, that makes me concerned.
This marijuana idea is a bad thing and we have to stop it. Can someone tell me exactly how that happens? I'm just kind of curious. John Lord, billionaire, owns 28 live wells, I don't know, 13 live wells, 100 live wells, I don't know how many he's got, a bunch of them. Native Roots has, I don't know, 26, 13, 22, there you go. I mean, so you're looking at these dispensary owners that have billions of dollars invested in their businesses. We have hedge funds that are invested in our businesses. California just legalized marijuana, and even if we don't talk about what they're doing out there, definitely the Wild West, the money coming in from California is ridiculous. Colorado has done over $500 million in tax revenue. We just hit $1 billion in sales, is at the end of September, I believe. Yeah, damn. So I want someone to tell me exactly how that's gonna happen. So Jeff Sessions is gonna come in here and start arresting us? Well, they can arrest me because I don't have $1 billion. Were they really gonna start with the first black woman? I don't think so. So, are they lying? Which would be a battle that I'd be willing to take on. But, are they gonna start with John Ward, the billionaire? Are they gonna start with, is that me? I don't know.
Yes, you're getting too close together, keep the mic quiet.
So I don't know how that happens. Now, once again, smarter people up here from me will tell me, well, they'll roll back that, and they'll roll back that, and then they'll do this, and the cops will come in, and the cops start arresting people. Really? 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 I don't see that happening. And maybe it is, and maybe I'm being way too flippant about this, or maybe I'm being a little bit too confident in the people who come into my dispensary, because the people that come into my dispensary look like you guys. They're older, they're moms and dads, and they're from Kansas, and we do about 60% tourism in our dispensary. So I'm just curious how this happens. And then they're gonna send back a Republican congressman or Republican senator to Colorado that's gonna say, Cory Gardner's gonna stand in front of office and say, we're gonna end 25,000 jobs, and we're gonna take away a few $1 billion, and we're gonna take you 578 dispensary owners out of business right now. What happens? How does that work?
Well, we've gotten a sense of the political landscape, and that's very helpful, but let's now talk about what those mechanisms look like. And if we could get that Cole memo explainer going, I think that would be a good first start for talking about what these mechanisms are and how this whole thing could unravel.
Sure, let me start with Cole, unless you want to.
No, you go for it.
So, James Cole was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States under Eric Holder, and after Colorado and Washington legalized, the states were in this period of flux where they didn't know how the federal government was going to respond to states explicitly defying federal law. And the solution from the Department of Justice was penned by a team at Justice, and James Cole's name was on it. And what it is a recommendation, a guidance, a memo from the Office of the Deputy Attorney General to the United States attorneys, to federal prosecutors throughout the United States, saying to them, we essentially recommend you do not prosecute in states that have legalized marijuana, and Cole is pretty comprehensive. It covers medical and recreational use, medical and recreational states. If a state has reformed its laws, that state has set up a regulatory system in response to those reforms, and the actors in that system are not engaging in 8 specific areas that are considered bad acts. And so some of those bad acts are selling to children, diverting product out of the legal market into an illegal market, working with international drug cartels or narco traffickers, diverting product out of state, having product cross state lines, and a few others. And so long as an entity within a legal state complies with that, U.S. attorneys are encouraged not to prosecute individuals, dispensary owners, growers, processors, etc. There's no protection in illegal states, and there's no protection if you're selling to kids or working with cartels. DEA can go in and raid you. U.S. attorneys are encouraged to prosecute you. And in fact, frankly, this is something that isn't talked about enough. The first people screaming for those entities to get prosecuted are people within the marijuana industry who don't want it ruined for everyone else, who don't want it ruined for them, and think that sales to kids and crossing state lines and working with narco traffickers and engaging in other felonies is the worst thing for this industry because it fits into the stereotype of this industry. And so I think people think often that this Cole memo was just a way for the Obama administration to punt. I think that's true. And it's something that, you know, the average marijuana user thinks this is good, that it's for protection. But I would argue that if there are a lot of things that the marijuana industry would have liked to have seen other than the Cole memo, bigger than the Cole memo, but there's really not a word in the Cole memo that most members of the marijuana industry disagree with, except that it doesn't go far enough.
So, do you want to? Okay, go. Just go. You do what you want to do. You should just respond.
Well, unless this is a question specifically about the.
Let's see what you're saying.
Okay. Well, I was just going to address the question that I think of, so it did take the Obama administration a long time to come up with the full memo. And I believe that during that time, they were evaluating, considering whether they could do a direct challenge to the state laws and whether they would be successful in that. And that's something that comes up, I think, sometimes about, well, can't these violate federal laws, or can't the federal government just come in and shut them down or undo them? And I actually think that is fairly hard for the federal government to do, which is one of the reasons why the Obama administration decided not to pursue that. A huge reason is what Wanda pointed out, that there are a lot of people involved. It's a big industry. There's a lot of very invested actors, from owners, but also the states themselves that are taking revenue. People like it in the states. It's working, and it's working out well. But I think also legally, one of the most basic things that we've been looking at since we've been drafting the laws from the very beginning is how to create a system that survives a federal preemption challenge to not conflict with federal law. And they're very carefully designed to give us the strongest legal argument we can in that regard. And that means that sometimes we make policy choices, unfortunately, I think, with that question in mind. And if our two federal and state governments were aligned in terms of public policy, we might create something that functioned better. But at the forefront always had to be a consideration of how to protect it from both federal interference and a direct federal challenge. So I think they're actually as well situated as possible to do that. And I think when the federal actors looked and examined the actual laws themselves, they saw that. The second reason is that the part that's most susceptible to challenge, or actually the only part that's at all susceptible to challenge from the federal government, is the regulatory part, not the legalization part. So they can't do anything about legalization. There's no question at all that states can withdraw state law penalties for any conduct they want, marijuana cultivation, murder, I mean anything. This federal government cannot tell the state to make anything illegal under state law. And the vast majority of drug law enforcement, marijuana law enforcement happens on the state and local level. And there's virtually nothing the federal government can do that to force a state to do it or to replace that enforcement capacity. They can't go into Colorado and arrest everybody and enforce marijuana laws across the board in every state, so they can't do that. So I think politically, legally, and practically, it's very, very difficult for the federal government to challenge the laws across the board in a way that undoes it. And what they're left with then is trying to, maybe do some sort of sporadic challenge that creates uncertainty or target specific actors, which will, could potentially damage individuals, and I think hinder like where we all want the industry to go in terms of being as opaque, as transparent as possible, and above the board possible, make it functioning in terms of banking and everything else. But I think it's very, very difficult for them to actually undo the state systems, and that's why what emerged out of the Obama administration was something like the Cole memo, the sort of intermediate thing. And I think now that actually we're seeing Sessions task force look at it and others look at it, they're starting to see like, well, actually they arrived at this memo for a number of reasons that brings us to a similar place.
I think the debate about the Cole memo is really interesting because people get hung up on, Sessions going to repeal the Cole memo and the content of the Cole memo, and really, the challenge of the Cole memo is like, it's a rather, in some ways, meaningless document. It's the symbolism of it that was important. It was who put out the document and the timing of it, and it was the fact that it was widely perceived as, a qualified green light for legalization to go forward, right? And so, the question now is like whether Cole or not is repealed. You could easily look at those 8 guidelines and say, oh, like that state is violating, marijuana going across state lines or something like that, therefore we're going in. And so, for me, like the Cole memo debate is a little bit like, it's a little bit like one of these flowcharts where like, are they going to repeal the Cole memo? Like yes or no? Like if they are going to repeal the Cole memo, then the second question, that's not the panic moment, right? Which I think people are like, oh my God, they've repealed the Cole memo, they put out new guidance, what does this mean? The second tranche of that is like, are they going to actually put resources into enforcing whatever new guidance they have, even if it's very similar to the Cole memo? And then again, to the point that's being made, what do those resources look like? What does the crackdown look like? Is it really sort of shutting down the industry? And I'm with Wanda on this. I think things have gone too far. But you can certainly see, as I said, like, a chilling effect. There are certainly lots of tools at the disposal of the Department of Justice to cause problems. I mean, the challenge for me is like, I don't think Colorado's going to shut down based on like what Jeff, I think if Jeff Sessions had a magic wand, then you would absolutely do that. But I think like the challenge is the chilling effect in stopping the progress and slowing the progress that we've made on this issue and the progress that we thought we'd have made under the other administration. So again, like a lot of folks get really caught up in the coal memo and is it going to be repealed and what Sessions is going to be doing. And for me, that's not really the most important question here.
Okay.
So three quick things. One is, for those of you who are students of public policy or lawyers, you want to remember that before the Cole memo of August of 2013, there was actually two previous memos. So there was a memo in 2009 and 2011. 2009 you could describe as states' rights for medical marijuana businesses, and then in 2011 was states' rights for medical marijuana patients, but not businesses, so it got worse. And then 2013 was states' rights for everyone. So, yes, the 2013 memo was influenced by the elections in Colorado and Washington State. It's very clear if you look at the chronology. Okay, the second thing is that the Cole memo, the thing is that it actually will be torn up because there's no way the Justice Department is going to keep a Democrat lawyer's name on a memo for 4 years. I mean, and it's not to say that they're bad people, like why would you really? Like you got elected and you're supposed to like keep the same piece of paper, like no. So they're going to they're going to have a new piece of paper with the Justice Department lawyers, a Republican whose name was on it, and I seriously doubt that every single word in the memo is going to be exactly the same. Therefore, there's going to be a change. So you heard it here first. There's going to be a change. Okay, so lastly is that for those of you who are worried at cocktail receptions and otherwise and having night terrors about the Justice Department and the Cole memo and how it's going to be torn up and replaced with something, don't worry, there's a solution, right? So Congress trumps people. So it doesn't matter how bad the Cole memo is, because the Rohrabacher Amendment, which is medical marijuana, is law. So that trumps anything from the Justice Department's memo machine on medical marijuana, and then there's the McClintock Amendment, which would trump on recreational and the 8 adult use states, right? So I actually spend very little time worrying about Cole memo when it's going to be torn up, because I spend the best hours of my day thinking about Congress. And so I would recommend that for those of you who like to lobby or worry, spend 99% of your time thinking and worrying about Congress and 1% on the executive branch, because Congress is our salvation.
Whoa.
So,
let's talk about Congress. Let's talk about these amendments. What is the state of play? What do we have to look forward to in future amendment appropriation cycles? This is the celebrity deathmatch part. Like Rob and Michael, take it away. There's a little space out here if you want a capoeira.
Luckily, we agree on public policy. It's just a question of who's the more accurate oracle. So with regard to that, when I said there's the temporary congressional actions, so there's the appropriations process. So for those who are in drug policy reform, they usually worry about two tracks in Congress. There's the Judiciary Committee track, which is when you want to change law permanently. And then there's the Appropriations Committee track, which is the annual spending bills. The Appropriations Committee, it was called the Spending Committee. It's 12 subcommittees, one of which is Justice Department, one of which is Treasury, etc. One is which is Veterans. So those are usually the three we care about out of the 12. The Justice Department one is the spending for the Justice Department and DEA for 1 year, fiscal year that starts on October 1st of every year. And the two really sexy amendments on that is the Rohrabacher Amendment, which is the states' rights for medical marijuana, and then the McClintock Amendment, which is states' rights for all marijuana. So Rohrabacher was first enacted in December 2014. It's been reauthorized a few times. So December 2014 until the present, and at least until December 8th. And that's the question: is what are the chances that will be renewed for the next fiscal year? The McClintock Amendment is the ultimate amendment that we would want from a marijuana policy standpoint. So if you want a proxy vote for marijuana legalization in Congress, and we're not going to get a vote on marijuana legalization in Congress because that's like a bill, Judiciary Committee, you have to have a hearing, but they're not bound to have a hearing, so they're not, okay? So the way that you get to play with legalization in Congress is the McClintock Amendment, and it's McClintock-Paulus, which is that the Justice Department and the DEA are not allowed to spend any taxpayer money to interfere with any state marijuana laws, including the 8 adult use states. And that amendment, which was only like 5 guys lobbying on Capitol Hill 2 years ago, that amendment almost passed, right? So that was, I think it was 206 to 222 or something. It was a 9-vote spread. If you got 9 no votes that went to yes, it would have passed on the House floor. That was with almost no firepower. It was 5 people lobbying and no real money behind it. So think about that. And I bet you if we come up with a vote on McClintock again, I bet you it might actually pass by a smidgen because Congress is slightly better now than it was before in terms of the marijuana question. So on the Rohrabacher, and I'm going to just let Michael really make the case, I actually do think that there is a more than trivial chance that the Rohrabacher amendment will not be renewed. And it's tough to say whether the chance is 50-50, 60-40, but the thing is that there's 8 people in a dark room who have to figure it out. The appropriations process is the spending for the upcoming fiscal year, and there's 4 people from the House and 4 people from the Senate. 2 Ds, 2 Rs, 2 Ds, 2 Rs. There's 8 people. 4 of them are incorrigibly good on medical marijuana, and 4 of them are incorrigibly bad. So it's not a 4-4 vote because there are no votes in this secret room of 8. No reporters are allowed, and what really hurts me is no lobbyists are allowed. So there's 8 people, and you don't actually get to know for sure who said what to whom and who traded off what. So what we need is the 4 good Democrats to say, we think that the Rohrabacher amendment is so important to include in this bill, where it's currently in the Senate side but not in the House bill. We think it's so important to do the Senate version that we as Democrats are willing to give up something else. Maybe we're going to give up some jobs in Brooklyn or whatever it might be. So there is going to be a trade-off. We're not going to be there to witness it, and that's what makes me nervous, is how important is the Rohrabacher amendment to those 4 good Democrats relative to everything else.
Rob's silencing me, I can switch off my mic. So Rob's not entirely wrong, but he's also not entirely right. It's just that, we talked about this yesterday, it's a question of who's more nervous. Like Rob is spending a lot of time thinking about the Rohrabacher amendment, and I'm not, because I think that, people should be there should be due diligence here, and people should be, doing the lobbying and making the calls and writing the op-eds and all that stuff. But the fundamentals of the Rohrabacher amendment and its getting renewed are, for me, not really that different from, when it was renewed earlier on this year. In other words, last year, the House didn't have a vote on the Rohrabacher amendment, the Senate did, and we came to around, I think, sort of April, May time, and the amendment was included, and that's under a Trump administration. That's with Jeff Sessions writing letters and very clearly opposed to this. And I think a lot of that happens because once an amendment is included in an appropriations bill from a previous year, it's hard to get it back out, and it's actually Republicans and would have to really go to the mat to get it out. Now that could obviously happen, but they would be the ones having to trade something away, one of the things that they care about, guns, abortion, something like that. And like I say, we're in some ways in a better situation this year than last year. Last year at the negotiating table was Hal Rogers, right, on the House side. He's very gung-ho in his opposition to marijuana. He's not there anymore, and the people are not marijuana champions, but they're not, Jeff Sessions acolytes either. I think the fact that it passed the Senate this year unanimously was good. That's a committee that has Dianne Feinstein on it, and people like James Lankford who have, anti-marijuana bills, and it passed without objection, and that's a positive, and that's something to take to the table. And it's not like we lost a vote on the House floor on this, right? The dynamic is the Senate has passed it, and the House did not allow a vote, and this has been what happened the year before, so why should this year be different? And you don't have to believe me. I've had conversations with the folks that will be in the room, the Republicans that will be in the room about this amendment. And I said to them, we didn't get, we're not going to, this was a few months ago, we were probably not going to get a vote on the House side, but the vote just passed the Senate unanimously. What do you think that means? And they said to me, they have no reason to believe that it would be any different from previous years when it was added. So, the other dynamic in this is, Sessions is obviously wants the amendment out, and he's written letters, but they've ignored sessions once. The members of Congress are not necessarily on board with his position on marijuana, and this is a spending issue, right? We're deciding where the Department of Justice spends its money, and Congress, even the most gung-ho anti-marijuana people, are not necessarily on board with, amidst all the things going on in the country and the things that Republicans and Sessions himself wants to pursue through the Department of Justice, do not really believe that it's a good use of resources to go after medical marijuana patients and businesses and so on. So again, this is a question of sort of degrees of nervousness. Like, people should absolutely be doing their due diligence and be paying attention to this, and it's a very important amendment that I'm not.
I'm sorry.
I'm not as nervous as Rob on this.
I'm clearly. Okay.
I'm tempted to break out into the room where it happened from Hamilton, but I won't. We'll keep it moving. I'm interested if you guys could talk a little bit about the legislative landscape. Are there bills out there? What are the bills? What are the good bills? What are the bad bills? Where are we at with that aspect of this?
I'll agree with Rob in that I think there's a lot of bills out there, but it's mostly of like symbolic value. It's just these guys can't name a post office these days. The idea that they're going to move marijuana legislation is hard to believe, and so we saw the reintroduction of the CARES Act, medical marijuana bill, with ending medical marijuana prohibition, that had a better lineup in terms of Republicans and even members of the Judiciary Committee on the bill as it was introduced, which was good. But the Judiciary Committee, the challenge there is there are just almost everybody on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I'm talking about this because it's probably the place where if there was any action to take place, it would be through the Senate Judiciary Committee. The way that Chuck Grassley operates is he operates under consensus, right? And he will try and find agreement among all the different members on the committee as much as possible, even the Democrats, before he will move a bill forward. And I know that there have been conversations about marijuana legislation, but when you look at that committee, you have almost everybody on that committee is on some sort of bill, right? But it runs the gamut from like research only to like CBD to full medical marijuana, and so it's hard to see where an agreement would be made, and it's certainly hard to see where an agreement would be made on that committee that we would be happy with. I could see some senators going for like CBD only legislation, which Drug Policy Alliance would not support. I could see them doing like a research only bill, which I think we would not necessarily, I don't think we would support either, because you sort of get one bite of the apple in these things, and that's not that's not the top priority for us. And so there's a lot of, I mentioned before, I think the bill that was introduced that has received the most attention this year is the Cory Booker's Marijuana Justice Act, sorry. And I think that was a bill that received a lot of attention for specific reasons. We know that we worked with the Booker office, like they were interested in sort of legalising marijuana, but not, I think a lot of people already thought he supported marijuana legalisation, and so the conversation that we had, which we've had, over several years now with allies like one and MCBA, is around bringing the debate, and one took part in a wonderful briefing, I think a year and a half ago, we did in the House about diversity and inclusion in the marijuana industry, and it was great to see Senator Booker step out with a bill that wasn't maybe as broad as we would have hoped, but certainly was very sweeping and had racial justice and race at the heart of the issue. And I think that is helpful, because even though that bill stands a little chance of actually moving forward, it's a sort of indication, and I think you'll see more and more members get behind like the House version of the bill when it's introduced, for example. You'll see that that's members of Congress who support marijuana legalisation saying now, we're not just going to get behind any old form of legalisation, and we are concerned about the kind of the direction that the industry's gone in terms of its lack of diversity, and also we want to bear in mind the sort of some of the core reasons for legalising marijuana in terms of its impact on people of colour. And so I think that's a helpful conversation that is taking place now at the federal level that wasn't there before, and I think that's why that bill got so much attention.
So quickly, legislative process is really complicated and arcane and very difficult for most people to understand, And so if a lot of this sounds very jargony or very thick to understand, don't be down on yourself if you don't understand legislative process. There's a lot of things you can do in this country, like become president of the United States. We've got 3 in a row who don't understand legislative process in politics, so you've got that going for you. But, you know, Michael's right. I think one of the things that's very frustrating from the outside is, well, why don't we just push hard on the carers bill, or why don't we push hard on the Marijuana Justice Act? Why are we worrying about the appropriations process? The reason the appropriations process is used is it's the one thing Congress has to do, is keep the lights on. And so using riders and appropriations bills, using that process, is the way to say, listen, like Michael said, you can't even name a post office, but the one job you have, the only job that you absolutely have, we can manipulate that process, we can use that process, we can leverage that process to try to get advances, and that's a lot of what's been going on. When you look at some of this big picture legislation, some of it's very good, some of it's very short-sighted, there are a lot of gatekeepers. A political scientist calls it gatekeepers in Congress, and there's a lot of them. The Speaker of the House has almost total control over the legislative calendar. Paul Ryan's not a big supporter of marijuana reform. In the Senate, there are gatekeepers. The Majority Leader is one of them. But then as you go down, committee chairs. Bob Goodlatte, the head of the House Judiciary Committee, not a friend of yours. He is someone who will block this legislation. And if Bob Goodlatte doesn't want a bill, even a Senate-passed bill, to have a hearing, there will not be a hearing. And so when you look at the landscape of this legislation, you have to think about who those gatekeepers are. And right now in a Republican Congress, it's also true in Democratic Congresses too, there are a lot of gatekeepers who are opposed to marijuana reform. And so when you think, well, you know, 85% of people support medical marijuana, 60% plus of people support recreational marijuana, why isn't it getting through? It's getting through because it's not getting through because there are these gatekeepers who come from districts who don't have that level of support in their district for these types of reforms, or have people in their district who care about 150 other things before they care about marijuana. So it's easy for Bob Goodlatte to block every piece of marijuana legislation that's going to come through the Judiciary Committee, never let it see the light of day. But he doesn't have that kind of control over appropriations. And once you get something in, as Michael said, it's really hard to get something in, but it's even harder to get something out once it's there. Please.
So, once again, one of my issues with politics, and like I said, I'm probably getting to be one of the old rods in the room when it comes to cannabis, given all the younger folks and folks that do this for a living. My issue with politicians and the way that we do things is we continue to be polite, and I don't understand why. I just don't understand why. And one of my frustrations with, not anybody up here, but with our lobbyists and when we're talking about things and when we're moving forward, just real quick, Rob, how many lobbyists does the pharmaceutical industry have in Congress for every member of Congress? Isn't it ridiculous? It's like 10 people for every member or something ridiculous. So that these people hear pharmaceuticals, 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 pharmaceuticals. And so they're very up on that. And how many lobbyists do we have per congressperson on there?
Me, Michael, and Rob.
0.1000000. You know, so yeah, we're running through the halls of Congress outside of maybe Jared Polis. Everybody else is like, yeah. That's yeah, it's in the news. Yeah. But the problem is that we remain polite about it. And forgive me for what I'm about to do, but look around this room. It's mostly a white audience, mostly over 40, which is great, which is fantastic. But the issue that we have here, this real issue with drug war and what's happening here, this is a racial issue.
Preach on it.
How many of you people have smoked pot before it was legal? I did. Oh my God, room full of felons. Look at you guys. I mean, seriously.
Criminals.
All of you. Whether pot is legal or whether it is not, Americans will smoke pot. I don't know what that number is, but I'm going to guess somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of Americans will smoke pot. Not 80% of Americans have done meth. Not 80% of Americans have done heroin. Not 80% of Americans have done LSD. 80% of Americans have probably... I mean, it's ridiculous. So the fact that this is about race, make no qualms about what this administration is doing. This is about race. Jeff Sessions doesn't care about locking you up. It ain't about you. Could care less. Could absolutely care less about locking you up for smoking a joint. This is about race. And as long as we keep being polite, and we keep talking, you're just a member of Congress, you know, can we really please get this through? They're little sick children, we really want to make some nice, make some money and everything else, and do really great things. Excuse me, fuck that. I'm sick of it. I am sick of the polite conversation. I'm sick of people not calling the president a liar. I'm sick of the people not calling Jeff Sessions a racist. Because this is what this is about. We're going to bring back federal penitentiaries. Why? What are we going to fill them with? You? White guys over the age of 65? No? That's not what we're going to fill federal penitentiaries with. That's not what we're looking for. Why do we need more beds? Why are we looking to put more people in? Why is law enforcement getting a big push? It's called racism, folks, and if you don't want to call it that, then I don't know what else we're going to call it, because nobody gives a fat rat's ass about any of you smoking a joint. Nobody. This will not change until Americans decide to get unpolite. I know we're in the South, we're supposed to be polite. No. Days of being polite are done, finished, over, done. It needs to change. Call it what it is. This is a racist issue. It has nothing to do with who's smoking.
Right on. Yeah, I don't think that, for me, the issue isn't about being polite all the time. So we don't want to be impolite all the time. So for example, there are times and places where you really gotta press people's faces against the table, right? So back in the late 90s, we got 3 patients arrested for marijuana in congressional offices. So we targeted Bill McCollum from Florida, Joe Rogan from north of LA, and Bob Barr, who we ended up hiring later.
That's how it works.
And it's because he converted and we did not. So yes, civil disobedience is a time and place, and apparently in 3 congressional offices it sort of worked a bit. And then also there's a time and place to be polite with the marijuana industry. So I found that I threaten someone once a year. Arizona 2015, Massachusetts last year, I don't know who's going to get it this year. And so there are times and places to get people arrested. It's times and places to threaten industry people. And we just got to make sure as activists that there's the right balance of when to protest, when to get arrested, and when to lobby. And I like Michael's accent, so I think he's good on the Hill, and we want to keep him in the good graces of these members of Congress that some of us dislike.
So we've come to the part that you all love. It's your turn. Real quick, just want to give a shout out to Papa Smurf, Ethan Nadelman, who just came in, who gets to enjoy the conference now, not run around like a madman putting it on. All right, built a movement. Thank you. So I see a lot of hands. Remember the rules. I'm holding the mic. I'm going to take like 3 questions in a row. We'll have them answer them.
If Sessions is going to arrest me, it's going to be for my impersonation of him.
Questions?
Yes. I like that you bring up the popularity of marijuana reform, but gun laws and other things are even much more popular. Science shows that what we care about as people has little correlation with what Congress does. It's what the elites, what the 1% think. So can you speak to that? What do the 1% think about these marijuana reforms, and how do we get them on our side to get Congress on our side?
Okay, one more question. And hopefully not all white men.
I work for a member of Congress and I write the postal service recommendations, vote recommendations, and we named 2 post offices last week, so I resent that. Also, in the unlikely event that Democrats take either chamber of Congress in 2018, what effect would that have? And I was going to ask that question in the criminal justice panel, but the moderator was sort of a jerk and didn't allow me to, so feel free to expound on that in the criminal justice context as well.
Okay, let's take those 2 and I'll come around.
Yeah, he was a good job, wasn't he? Congrats on the post office. You're really making America great again. I guess like the Democrats taking control of the House and the Senate. It's just a question for me of like how high on the priority list does marijuana. And I think this ties into one of the previous questions and something that a guy who I thought was smart once told me, said that support for marijuana was a mile wide and an inch deep. In other words, there's a lot of support for it, right? We see that in polls, but it's not really a lot of people's number one issue, right? And when you look at going into like the next Congress, you know, healthcare and immigration reform and all that sort of stuff, and a lot of the big ticket issues. And again, like it's sort of, you see that just now with Republicans in charge, like it's hard to do anything that's remotely controversial, and I guess marijuana for a lot of people, it's not, there isn't consensus across the board, like we do have bipartisanship on it, but it's like 25 Democrats and Dana Rohrabacher sometimes, you know, and so, which is, you know, it is what it is, but it's sort of, the question for me is, I don't know if we're going to be like forced out of the traps, you know, in terms of like committee hearings and so on. So it would obviously be better for our issue if Democrats were in charge of like the House and the Senate. I mean, but the Senate, like Dianne Feinstein could be the chair of the Judiciary Committee, like that's not good. You know, probably rather have Chuck Grassley, to be honest. Seriously. Yeah. For a number of issues, but so yeah.
So I think these two questions are actually connected. The first question about the 1%. The 1% is probably largely with you as long as they're the 1% under the age of 65. Or if they get cancer, or a child has an epileptic disorder, or what. And so the challenge, though, is if you are in the top 1%, and let's say you're close to the president, what are you going to ask the president to do? Give you a tax cut, right? Or turn the lights on. And there are a lot of other things. Now it's just a rave. Are there any maps people in the room? So if you're going to ask for a lot of things before you're going to ask...
Can someone tell Jeff Sessions to stop playing with the lights?
Before you're going to ask for marijuana reform. So I think a lot of people in the 1%, when you think about tech leaders and other people in the industry like that, they are not opposed to marijuana reform, but they are much more supportive of other issues. Because again, marijuana never polls in the top 20 issues among Americans. Top 20 issues by Gallup, marijuana has never broken into that. Now, other issues related to marijuana, as Wanda said, racial justice, criminal justice issues, it is in there, but rote marijuana reform never appears. It's true for the mass public, it's true for the 1%, it's true for Donald Trump's friends, and that makes it so this just doesn't get to a presidential level, even though, especially from a racial justice perspective, it should be toward the top of the list.
Okay, I'm taking 4 more questions.
Wait.
You can't see me, but I'm Scott about Wanda James's husband. And you can't see me, well, I'm not going to go there. Let me just say this, I'm not going to let this panel get off the racism thing. It is really about racism. I mean, it is about being angry, and you have to be angry all the time. The anger doesn't have to come from a politician, it needs to come from the general public. And here's one of the things, and where it becomes angry is white men and white women need to be on the stage with black men and black women. Okay? It happens not from us getting angry, it happens from people who are not black getting angry and joining us. So the question is, and it goes back to this is, I'm not letting you off the hook, racism should be at the top here. So the question is, how do you get more whites to get on board with blacks and standing on that same stage and making those same comments? That's the thing. And what have we done to create those bridges between black and white? We have.
Okay. Exactly. One more. Hold on. Come on. Marcia?
Yeah, so I'm curious about Trump's base. Now, I get your point about most people don't really care about this issue, but what about, setting aside the evangelicals for a minute, what about his gun-toting, pot-smoking, the other part of his base? Are they going to be happy about prohibition once again?
Okay, right here, we're going here, young person.
Really quickly, thank you, Wanda. I just want to ask, now this is a race issue, right? But in the context of race, gender, and all of that brings in class, where does the youth come into all of this? Because like she said, 65-year-old and old white people, but then we get to like black people and we start from the top. So how do we actually like align this for people who are actually most vulnerable and most impacted?
Excuse me, want to get through here? Great question. One more. Okay.
jobs are what the Trump administration cares about. When are we going to talk about hemp and using that as a gateway into this administration? Because they do care about jobs.
Okay, panel.
So as a white male on the panel, let me start with the first question. You know, I think one of the troubles that exist in terms of motivating white Americans who would normally be interested in this issue, progressives would be, other liberals would be, libertarians would be as well, thinking about racial justice issues, is that even though there's a lot of good information out there that helps explain racial disparities in criminal justice, people are not listening to them, they're not reading them. I think there is a large segment in our society that believes that people of color are arrested at much higher rates than whites are because they use more, even though that's empirically proven to be false. I think that there is a lack of understanding of what that experience as a person of color is like. As a white male who grew up lower middle class, I know that if I grew up as a person of color, lower middle class, I would have had a dramatically different experience. It is almost certain that I would not be where I am today, not because of the choices I made, but because of the choices that were made for me. But there are a lot of people who don't understand that. And so knowing what you don't know is part of that battle. And as much as rich white progressives like to knit hats and go on marches, it ends at that point. And that real empathy that is desired, that empathy that is needed, is easy to dismiss. It's easy to have an alternative explanation for it. It's easy to look the other way. It, however, is a real opportunity. When you show people these numbers, when you get them to read about this issue, it becomes eye-opening. It's just a matter of communicating that and getting that information in front of them. And frankly, I would argue, trying to convey it in a way that sort of induces empathy by saying, listen, you probably face some factor in your life too that puts you at odds. Maybe as a young person in America, it's an inability to get the same kind of job that your parents were able to get when they were 22 years old. Trying to help put them in the shoes of facing a challenge, I think is an easy way to open their eyes to bigger challenges than they will ever face in their lives, and then try to get them on board.
But that's been 300 years and it hasn't happened. You take part out of it, we're still getting arrested, so it's really still not a solution to that.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in. I think that it is actually more than just getting a message in front of people. I think we have to dig a lot deeper and make sure our reforms are broader and more meaningful. So when we're moving forward with legalization on the state level, we're broadening our conversations that talks about undoing the harm of what we did in the past, making sure people have access to what's coming before, and both, get people excited, show that this is actually going to be meaningful change to people's lives. And I think in terms of elevating, like you said, the 1%, this doesn't even rise to the top 20 issues, but in there are things like racial justice and criminal justice reform, and that's what marijuana law reform should be. And the reform should be meaningful enough to encompass both of those things, and bring in people who care about those issues, and elevate that piece. And I think as it then does, once the laws are more than sort of symbolically that as part of the messaging, but are that in a meaningful way, then I think you do separate out the Jeff Sessions, who are motivated to keep in place what we have by racism, from others who are then at the table who care about those, maybe didn't ever really think about marijuana or care about marijuana, but do really care deeply about criminal justice reform and social justice and racial justice. And suddenly the reforms that states are adopting and implementing are about that in a meaningful way, brings people to the table and moves it forward.
For the young man over there who asked about how do we get more young people and how does this affect our young people, quite frankly, legalization has affected our young people very negatively in Colorado. What's happening in Colorado is, I don't think people are aware of this, while if you're over the age of 21, you probably won't get arrested in Colorado for having cannabis. If you're under the age of 21, if you happen to be white, you probably will not get arrested. If you are Latino, you are 15 times more likely, or 50% more likely to get arrested now that cannabis is legal. And if you happen to be a black young person under the age of 21, you have now a 50% chance since legalization of getting more arrested. So what we have done in Colorado is, yes, we've stopped arresting black grown-ups, and now we're indoctrinating our children much earlier. These are the legislative issues that we need to fix. Unintended consequences is what they call them. Once again, I call them the politeness of bullshit. Because we're arresting children, stop it. I mean, I don't know what else we need to talk about. But the other amazing thing, though, that I find on the other side of that is the entrepreneurship and the ingenuity of young people right now. I spend most of my time talking to University of Colorado, University of Denver, their marketing classes, their business classes. Every single young person coming out of college right now is intrigued with this industry. And I love it because they don't ask me, how do I own a dispensary, how do I own a grow? They want to know, if I broke down the mathematics of this flower and the so many different things, and if we did this and if we did that, and we changed this and we changed that, and I'm just like, I don't know, that's fantastic. I mean, it's amazing what's coming out of young people, and that's what we have to have happen in this age of legalization, is the businesses that young people are thinking about on a daily basis that we haven't even thought of. It's amazing.
There was a gun toting question too. I think for President Trump's base, if you take away their marijuana but not their guns, they're probably going to be okay with that because their guns are more important to them. And that's sort of a way of, again, of getting back to the point of how people prioritize the issues that matter to them. Chances are, if you're gun-toting and they remove your ability to access the commercial market, you're probably going to grow at home or you're going to find some alternative way. In the same way that if they take your guns away, you're going to probably find some alternative way. But gun rights, especially to the Trump base, is top 5, top 10 issue. Even for, like you said, pot smoking, gun-toting people, marijuana is still not that big of an issue for them. And so when you're thinking about balancing the intensity of support versus the level of support, these are the things that even for someone like a Trump base voter who likes that, it's not there for them.
Okay, next round. I see you.
So I have a two-part question. The first part is about Roger Stone, Trump advisor, friend, and despicable person. But he was recently invited to speak at a cannabis industry conference, and there was so much protest against his speaking there by some industry people, some DPA people, and other people, that he was disinvited. And I wanted to know if you think that's a good tactic or not, or where should we stand with people like that? The second part is about Dana Rohrabacher, who we love for his support for a great friend of the cannabis issue. But his other positions we hate. And he's also being targeted in California because we're trying to turn more of the Republican congressional seats blue. So I'd like to know, what is your take on these two people?
Okay, we're going to take some more.
Ms. James, Donald Trump was willing to take away health insurance from 23 million Americans. I don't think he's going to hesitate taking away some marijuana grows from a couple of billionaires, especially since 7 of the 8 marijuana legalization states have voted for Hillary Clinton. I agree with Mr. Campia. It's 99% congressional, 1% federal. My question is when in the world is people like you, not you per se, but the marijuana industry going to get out there and start giving money to Democrats so we can retake Congress, because it's only the Democrats that are going to stop Trump and stop Sessions.
I got a list going. If we have more time.
Yes, hi, Tori Sheridan. Thank you, Wanda, for mentioning the youth. I have a question about, I'm in college, I have plenty of internships in Nevada, ready for the new cannabis generation to learn and to exceed what we know already. So is there any room for that conversation here about where I can't talk with the Board of Regents because they're afraid their federal funding will be pulled if we have anything cannabis related on campus?
If I could real quick on the Roger Stone piece, if I give you a real 5-second overview on that. Roger Stone was speaking and we didn't realize that he had already spoken, all the stuff had come out of him. I got an email from the wonderful Amanda Ryman that said, I won't speak with this clue word and are you with me? I was like, oh no, oh no, oh no. Within about an hour, there were 7 very prominent women pulling together email list and how we were going to stop Roger Stone from coming out. The hashtag Disown Stone came out probably about 30 minutes after that conversation. Lee Highs, the former CEO of Women Grow, Tiffany Bowden, Laura Pageant, DPA, I know I'm forgetting everybody, but these amazing group of women, we all came together and just email listed and started pulling things together, and then DPA came out with a wonderful statement, and then the list of people that we started asking not to be there started growing and growing and growing. CWBE took, I think, too much time in uninviting Roger, but you know, at the end of the day, they got it done, which is what we always want to see happen, so we definitely support them in that. And then some of my conflicts with the industry is High Time turns around and gives him his whole little page where he can continually talk about misogyny and other things. So I think we need to be able to stop those types of things, and I think that that's also one of Trump's buddies that you talk about, you know, that has Trump's ears supposedly. I mean, I guess it's good if they're talking about that kind of stuff, but I don't think that we give racist and misogynist a panel to speak on. We don't encourage that. Just because you support cops doesn't mean we support you.
Right.
And for young people, yeah, I think that it's amazing, and it's sad that so many universities, I'm actually fighting with my alma mater right now because we want to put, my goal is to rename the CU Law School the Simply Pure School of Law, but they won't let me put together money that comes from the industry, from Simply Pure, to put black kids specifically through law school. So that's going to be the first battle that I'm going to be bringing to CU, and this is what I'm saying, time for polite conversation is over, so we need to start challenging some of these things so that people start opening these doors to what the new generation is doing. I mean, we're done, I mean, we're already done it, so now for those folks that come up, we've got to be able to open those doors.
So on the last question on boards of regents and such, I think this is an underappreciated issue right now in higher education. And so for full disclosure, Tori is from the SSDP at UNLV, and Brookings has a funded partnership with the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I'm not speaking specifically about the board at UNLV or the Board of Regents for NSHE, but throughout the country, General's Counsel for universities are there to say no. They are there, obviously, to protect the institution, but their goal is to say no. The thing is, the General's Counsel in universities don't know a damn thing about marijuana law. So it's easy for them to say, oh no, we're going to lose all our federal funding if we take this money. The reality is they're probably not in almost every case. And so I think the marijuana law community, which I'm not a part of, but the marijuana law community really needs to start spearheading an effort to communicate with universities throughout the United States, because these issues are hurting our young people who are serious about this industry. As Wanda said, you know, a lot of people shit on millennials. I'm in the very beginning of what is considered a millennial. Millennials are changing this world for the better, and they're not all sitting home playing video games and living in their parents' basement. They're people like Tori who are trying to go out there and make a difference in this world and get ahead in an industry that people over the age of 60 are scared shitless by. And it is barriers to entry, barriers to opportunity by institutions of higher education because a president, because a general counsel, because a provost or someone else says, wait, where did that money come from? Oh no, they're going to pull all our NIH funding if we take $1 of industry money, and it's bullshit.
So it looks like we've been told we have about 2 minutes left, so I'll just say as my closer real quick is that in terms of whether or not to support a Dana Rohrabacher type, it depends. If you're like a full-service liberal activist, then you would not want to, right? But if you're actually a marijuana legalization advocate, then you would want to. So it kind of depends on whether your role in life is like sort of broad-based or single issue. I do know people who say they're marijuana activists, and then they would actually support a candidate who wants to put them in prison for marijuana. Now that's okay if you want to do that, if you're a full-service liberal and sort of okay with compromising on that, but I'm personally not. I'm also a single issue, which means we do support Dana Rohrabacher financially, partially because he's our leader in the Republican side, and partially because we don't support our leaders in Congress, and then there's really good members of Congress who want to be supportive, and they look and they see that we don't have the backs of our leaders, and they might actually be less likely to join us. Good people, less likely to join us. Lastly, I will say that I think it's important that when we think about our life's goals of what we want to accomplish, it doesn't necessarily mean that it dictates the means to that end. For example, for me, I'm actually motivated by freedom, but when you do polling, American people don't care about freedom. So when we do TV ads, we don't say legalize marijuana because we want to be more free. We say legalize marijuana because of tax money, right? So I don't let my personal biases get involved in the messaging and the tactics. So with that, I will say that where I think we could have the most impact in terms of changing federal law, Congress, is to get serious about organizing Republican primary voters in key congressional districts. Republican primary voters. And there's 5 districts that are on my mind in Texas alone.
All right, my people, we've come to the end. And I know there are going to be some haters because I didn't get to your questions. It's okay. The panel will be up here. I just want to say 2 things really quickly. One is, please take out your smartphone and fill out the session evaluation on your app and give us a good rating. No, I'm just kidding. You can say whatever you want. And then the last thing is I want to please give everybody a hand. Wanda, John,